My name is Grace Whitfield. I am 63 years old. I taught 4th grade at Weaverville Elementary just outside Asheville, North Carolina, for 31 years. And on the night of my granddaughter's high school graduation, my own daughter stood up in front of 40 of our closest family and friends and told them I was no longer safe to live alone. The party was on the back deck of the lake house Denise and her husband Marcus had bought 2 summers before, string lights looped between the porch posts, a caterer's folding table sagging under pulled pork and lemon bars. My granddaughter Emberly was still in her cap, laughing with her cousins down by the dock, her gown draped over a porch chair like she'd shed a second skin. I stood near the dessert table with a paper plate I hadn't touched, watching her, thinking about the day she was born and how I'd rocked her to sleep in the same chair I'd rocked her mother in 20 years before that. Then Denise tapped a fork against her wine glass. I thought she was going to toast Emberly. Everyone did. The deck went quiet the way it does before a proud parent says something sweet, 40 faces turning toward her with soft, expectant smiles. Before we get to that, Denise said, I need to say something. Because I love my mother. And because I can't keep pretending everything's fine. She looked at me when she said it. Not at Emberly. At me. 2 weeks ago, she said, her voice already trembling in the specific, practiced way that trembling voices have when they've been rehearsed in a bathroom mirror. I found Mom sitting in the dark at Larkspur with the stove burner still on. She didn't remember turning it on. She didn't remember I'd called her 3 times that afternoon. I've been so scared to say this out loud, but I don't think it's safe for her to live by herself anymore. I want you to understand what that felt like from the inside, because words like shocked and blindsided don't quite reach it. It felt like the deck tilted. 40 faces turned toward me the way they'd turned toward Denise a second earlier, except now the softness had curdled into something worse. Pity. I saw Harriet, my neighbor of 40 years, put a hand over her mouth. I saw a woman I didn't recognize, mid-50s, cardigan despite the June heat, watching me with the calm, clinical attention of someone taking notes without a notepad. That isn't what happened, I said. My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to, which is its own kind of trap, because a small voice sounds exactly like a frightened, confused one. Denise? I turned a burner down low to keep soup warm, and I fell asleep in the recliner for 20 minutes. That's all that happened. You know that's all that happened. Mom. She said it gently, the way you'd correct a child who insists the sky is green. It's okay. Nobody's angry. Marcus appeared at my elbow with a folding chair, guiding me into it with a hand under my arm like I might topple. You should sit, Grace. Rest a little. I hadn't asked to sit. My hip, replaced 2 years earlier, worked perfectly well. But that's the thing about being handled. Once it starts, refusing it only proves their point. The woman in the cardigan crossed the deck and crouched beside my chair with the kind of warmth people practice for a living. Mrs. Whitfield, I'm Carol and I'm a friend of Denise's. I just want to make sure you're comfortable. She said it like we'd never met, though something in the careful way she watched my eyes told me this wasn't the first time she'd looked at me and made a judgment. I sat there in that folding chair at my own granddaughter's graduation party with a plate of food I never touched, 31 years of standing in front of classrooms telling me exactly how a room looks when it has already decided something about you before you open your mouth. I didn't cry. I want that on the record. I sat very straight, the way my mother taught me to sit in church, and I said quietly to no one in particular, I'd like to go home now. What I did not know, sitting there with cake I never ate, was that the papers were already filed. My daughter had walked into the Buncombe County Courthouse 9 days earlier and sworn out an emergency petition with her name on it and mine underneath. This wasn't an intervention. It was a rehearsal for a hearing, performed in front of 40 witnesses, and I was the only person in that yard who didn't already know the court date. Welcome to Silent Heart's Echoes, where the stories are real and the women in them are stronger than anyone gave them credit for. If you've ever been underestimated by your own family, talked over, talked about, treated like the room needed to be managed around you, this one's for you.
Stay until the end.
And subscribe because karma has better handwriting than people think. Let me back up. Because you need to know who I was before that deck, before any of this, so you understand exactly how wrong my daughter's story was and exactly how she built it anyway. I grew up outside Hendersonville, one of 5 kids, and I was the one who read the electric bill out loud at the kitchen table when I was 9 because my mother's eyes had started to fail and nobody else wanted to bother. I tell people that detail sometimes when they ask how I ended up a teacher who could balance a school's entire supply budget in her head. The truth is I've been the person who reads the fine print since before I could ride a bike without training wheels. I met my husband Walter at a county fair in 1985. He was fixing the Ferris wheel operator's generator for free because the operator was a friend of his father's, greased to his elbows, whistling badly. I told him he was whistling badly. He told me I had opinions about everything. We were married 14 months later. Walter taught shop class at the high school for 32 years. Small engines, woodworking, the kind of practical, patient teaching that doesn't show up on a resume, but shows up in 1,000 small ways in the men who took his classes and still wave at me from their trucks at the hardware store. We bought the house on Larkspur Lane in 1988, a modest 3-bedroom with a wraparound porch and a garage Walter turned into a workshop, and we paid it off, dollar by dollar, by the time I turned 55. No mortgage, clear title. Our names both on the deed. That house was the one thing in our life that had never owed anybody anything. We had 2 children. Denise came first, sharp and quick and hungry for attention in a way that could be charming or exhausting depending on the day. The kind of child who could talk a teacher into an extra 10 minutes of recess and somehow make it sound like the teacher's idea. She was homecoming court, she was student council. She sold more fundraiser chocolate bars than any kid in the history of Weaverville Middle, and I loved her for all of it even when some small, unspoken part of me noticed that her affection tended to arrive attached to a need. Nathaniel, Nate, came 4 years later, and he was Denise's opposite in nearly every way. Quiet, watchful. He'd spend whole Saturdays down at the creek behind our property cataloging crawdads in a notebook, and by high school he knew more about the salmon runs of the Pacific Northwest than most adults know about their own backyard. He left for college in Oregon and never really came back, not because he didn't love us, but because his whole heart had gone to the mountains and the rivers the way some men's hearts go to a woman. He became a wildlife biologist for the state of Alaska, spending long stretches of the year out at remote research camps studying salmon migration, weeks at a time with no cell signal, sometimes nothing but a shared satellite line for emergencies. I think back now to a small thing that happened when Denise was 16, running the concession stand at the county softball tournament for her school's booster club. At the end of the weekend, the till came up $60 short, and Denise had an explanation ready before anyone even asked. A spilled cash box, a confused vendor, a story with just enough specific, verifiable-sounding detail that the booster club treasurer apologized to her for the inconvenience of asking. I remember thinking at the time how proud I was that my daughter could stay so calm under a little pressure. It did not occur to me for another 22 years to wonder where that particular kind of calm actually came from, or what it might look like turned towards something larger than a cash box. Walter died 5 years ago, on a Tuesday in October, replacing a fence post in the side yard. A stroke, the doctors said, likely instant. I was inside grading a stack of book reports for a substitute teaching gig I'd picked up after retirement. I never could sit still, and I found him when I went out to call him for lunch. I won't dwell on that afternoon longer than it deserves in this telling, except to say that grief teaches you things about yourself you didn't know were there, and one of the things it taught me was who shows up and who performs showing up. Denise showed up loudly. She organized the funeral flowers. She gave a beautiful eulogy that made the whole church cry. She posted photographs online with captions about her father's legacy that got hundreds of comments. And then, in the quiet months after, when the casseroles stopped coming and the house went silent in that particular way houses go silent after 40 years of 2 voices become one, Denise was the one who started coming by on Sundays with groceries I hadn't asked for, sitting at my kitchen table saying, "Let me help you with the bills, Mom. You've got enough on your plate. I want to be fair to my daughter because fairness matters to me more than it probably should, given everything that came after." I believe some part of her genuinely loved me in those early months. I also believe, looking back with the clarity that only comes from having your own bank records printed out in front of you, that some other part of her had already begun to see my grief as an opening. The real door didn't open with grief. It opened with a hip. 2 years ago, my right hip finally gave out after decades of stubbornly ignoring what an orthopedist had been telling me since I was 50. I had the replacement done at the regional medical center, a routine surgery that goes sideways more often than people admit, and I came out of anesthesia groggy and disoriented in the particular way that makes you sign whatever's put in front of you, because signing feels easier than asking a question you can't quite form. Denise was there when I woke up. Of course she was. I was grateful for that, genuinely. She'd taken 2 weeks off from her job at the real estate office to manage my recovery, driving me to physical therapy, refilling prescriptions, sleeping over the first several nights on the pull-out couch. If you had asked me at the time to describe my daughter, I would have used the word devoted, and I would have meant it. On the third day home from the hospital, she came in with a folder of what she called just the discharge paperwork, plus a couple things so I can help you with bills while you're laid up, nothing major, just in case. I remember the phrase, just in case. I remember signing where she'd flagged with yellow tabs, my hand still a little unsteady, my mind fogged with the tail end of hospital painkillers, trusting the daughter sitting beside my bed the way you trust anyone you nursed through chicken pox and taught to tie her shoes. One of those yellow tabs was a durable general power of attorney, naming Denise as my agent with broad authority over my financial affairs. It was notarized that same afternoon by a woman named Wendy Pruitt, a co-worker of Denise's from the real estate office, who came by the house for 15 minutes with a stamp and a smile, and left without, as I'd later learn, ever actually watching me sign a single page. I didn't think about that document again for the better part of 2 years. Why would I? I trusted my daughter. I had raised her. I had held her hand crossing streets and sat up with her through every fever and heartbreak of her childhood, and it did not occur to me, not once, that trust could be a door. What I know now and did not know then is that a power of attorney is a master key. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up as a single dramatic theft. It shows up as small, reasonable-sounding adjustments, one at a time, each of them individually forgettable. The bank statement started arriving at Denise's address instead of mine, just to make it simpler while you're getting back on your feet. A new joint signer was added to my checking account. In case of an emergency, Mom, you know at your age, said with a laugh, softening a sentence that would have stung if I'd let myself hear it clearly. A property tax bill I used to pay every October got folded into stuff I'm handling now, don't worry about it. Each of these, alone, sounded like exactly what a good daughter does for an aging mother. Strung together, quietly over 2 years, they built a wall around my own money with me standing on the wrong side of it. And there was a second wall going up at the same time, one I felt more than I could name, a thinning and erosion in my relationship with my son. Nate called less. I told myself it was the work, the long stretches at remote camps, the 8-hour time difference, the satellite phone that only worked on clear days. When we did talk, our conversations felt strangely secondhand, like we were catching each other up on facts we already half knew from somewhere else. Denise says you've been tired lately, he'd say, and I'd think, when did I tell Denise that, and let it go, because letting things go had become easier than chasing down every small, uneasy feeling. I mailed him a card for his 35th birthday, the kind with a hand-drawn salmon on the front, because I liked to imagine it made him smile at some research station 1,000 miles from anywhere. I never heard whether he got it. I told myself that was just Nate, bad about calling, worse about writing back, always had been since college. I did not yet know how much of what I believed about my own son had been handed to me, secondhand, filtered, edited, by the one person standing in the middle of every conversation in this family. The unraveling, mine, though I didn't call it that yet, began with something almost embarrassingly small, a bank statement that stopped arriving. I'd always preferred paper statements. Old habit, old eyes, and frankly I liked sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee and a highlighter, the same way I used to grade papers, running my eyes down every line. Around 7 weeks before Emberly's graduation, I realized I hadn't seen one in 3 months. I assumed it was a mail mix-up at first. Then I called the bank myself. I want to tell you what that phone call felt like, because I think it's the moment the whole shape of the next several months got decided, though I couldn't have known it yet. I sat on hold for 11 minutes, listening to hold music meant for someone with more patience than I had that morning, and when a representative finally came on the line and pulled up my account, there was a pause, the particular pause of someone reading something they weren't quite sure how to say out loud. "I see a home equity line of credit was opened on the Larkspur Lane property," she said. "10 months ago. Is there something specific I can help you with regarding that account?" "I didn't open a home equity line of credit," I said. Another pause. "The paperwork on file lists you as the property owner and Denise Whitfield Cole as attorney-in-fact under a power of attorney." I sat very still at my own kitchen table. In the house Walter and I had paid off dollar by dollar over 22 years, and I felt something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I did not raise my voice on that call. 31 years in a classroom teaches you that raising your voice is usually the moment you lose the room. I asked for certified copies of everything, thanked the woman for her time, and hung up. Then I put on real shoes, the kind you wear to be taken seriously, and I drove myself to the branch on Marymount Avenue. The manager, a courteous man named Philip with reading glasses on a chain, spent nearly 40 minutes with me that afternoon. What he told me, carefully, respectfully, in the language bank employees use when they suspect they're about to become a witness in something, was this: $85,000 drawn against the house, secured by a deed of trust, 71,000 of it already dispersed to an account controlled by Denise. 3 payments behind. A notice of default had gone out 6 weeks earlier, to Denise's address, not mine. I drove home with the certified copies on the passenger seat, and I want you to understand that what I felt in that car wasn't panic. It was the particular, focused stillness that used to come over me whenever a classroom went sideways and 40 small faces turned to me expecting order. I have never once, in my whole life, found chaos to be an excuse for not thinking clearly. If anything, it sharpens me. That evening, I sat Denise down at my kitchen table, the same table I'd realized much later, where she'd signed her own way into control of my life 2 years earlier, and I laid the papers out in front of her the way I used to lay out a report card in front of a parent. I didn't accuse. I asked. "Walk me through this," I said, "because I don't remember agreeing to a loan against this house, and I need you to help me understand." What happened next is the moment I'd point to if anyone ever asked me exactly when I stopped being able to give my daughter the benefit of the doubt. She didn't flinch. She reached over and took my hand the way you'd comfort someone confused, and she said, gently, patiently, like she was talking a nervous student through a math problem she'd already explained twice. "Mom, we talked about this. Right after your surgery. You said the rates looked good. You said do whatever made sense. I know the anesthesia messed with your memory those first few months. The doctor told us that could happen. It's okay. It's not your fault." I sat there and felt the floor tilt for the first time, the first of 2 times it would tilt that summer, the second being that folding chair on Denise's deck. Because here is the terrible, specific cruelty of that sentence. It offered me a door out. It offered to let this be my mind's failing instead of her theft. All I had to do was accept it, the way you accept a smaller, more comfortable lie over a larger, more painful truth. Some tired, grieving part of me wanted to walk through that door. I did not walk through it. I have taught 9-year-olds to check their own math for 31 years, and I checked mine. I remembered no such conversation, because no such conversation had ever happened. "I'd like copies of everything," I said instead. "For my own records." Her face changed for just a second. Not sadness, something quicker and colder, gone almost before I registered it, and she said, Of course, she'd pull it all together for me. She never did. What I didn't know, walking her to the door that night, was that I had just told my daughter, in the plainest possible language, that her clock was running out. I've thought a great deal, in the months since, about what must have happened in the 9 days between that kitchen table conversation and Emberly's graduation party, about the phone call I'd bet came from Wendy Pruitt, the notary, mentioning offhand that your mom called asking some funny questions about that power of attorney notarization, about the particular kind of panic that must ripple through a person who has spent 2 years building something on a foundation they know won't survive. An inspection. I know now that Marcus's short-term rental business, the cabins they'd been buying up and renting out under the name Ridgeline Getaways, had been quietly drowning for the better part of a year. A lawsuit from a guest who'd fallen down an unrepaired staircase at one of the properties, a business loan going into default, occupancy rates collapsing after a competitor undercut their prices 2 seasons running. I know now that the $85,000 pulled against my house hadn't gone toward helping Mom. It had gone toward keeping Ridgeline's lights on for one more quarter, in the desperate, familiar way that people throw good money after bad, hoping the tide turns before anyone notices the water's still rising. And I can't prove this part, but I believe it in my bones, that Denise understood, sitting across my kitchen table that night, that a woman who could ask precise questions about a helic and request certified copies of a deed was not a woman a judge would easily believe was incompetent. Which meant, if she was going to protect what she'd already taken, she needed the story to change. She needed witnesses. She needed a narrative that arrived before mine did. So she built one, and she built it in 9 days, and she built it in front of 40 people who loved us both, at a party for a girl in a cap and gown who had absolutely nothing to do with any of it. Carol and Whitmore, I'd learn, was a licensed geriatric care manager Denise had hired under the guise of a family friend, paid to observe me informally at the party and later write a short letter, not a clinical evaluation, just an observation, describing me as disoriented and reluctant to engage, which was, I suppose, one way to describe a woman who had just been publicly accused of nearly burning down her own house and had gone quiet with shock in a folding chair. 9 days after that kitchen table conversation, 3 days before the graduation party, Denise walked into the Buncombe County Clerk of Court's office and filed an emergency, ex parte petition for guardianship and conservatorship over me, supported by her own sworn statement and a brief letter from a physician who, I'd later learn, examined me for exactly 11 minutes. I found all of this out later, piece by certified piece. That night on the deck, all I knew was that my daughter had just told 40 people I couldn't be trusted with a stove, and that somehow, impossibly, everyone in that yard seemed more ready to believe her than to ask me a single direct question. 4 days after the party, on a Tuesday morning while I was watering the tomatoes Walter had taught me to stake and tidy, even Rose, a Buncombe County Sheriff's deputy, walked up my front path with an envelope, and my quiet, unremarkable life on Larkspur Lane became, officially, a court case. In the matter of the guardianship of Grace Ellen Whitfield, the judge had granted a temporary order. Effective immediately, my accounts were frozen pending a full hearing 30 days out. Denise was named temporary guardian of my finances in the interim. I was, on paper, still permitted to live in my own home, a small mercy the order seemed almost embarrassed to grant, but I could not access a checking account that had my name on the deed of the house it was meant to maintain. I found out exactly what that meant 2 hours later, standing at the grocery store on Merrimon with a cart half full of the ordinary things a person buys on an ordinary Tuesday: coffee, bread, the tomatoes I hadn't yet grown enough of myself, when my card was declined at the register. Declined, with a line building behind me, with the cashier saying let's try it again in the overly bright voice cashiers use when they already suspect it. I left the groceries at the register. I drove home. And I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table, always the same table, and for the first time since Walter died, I let myself cry, not out of self-pity, but out of a very specific, very clean fury at the unfairness of being disbelieved by your own child in front of everyone you know, with a judge's signature attached. Then I dried my face, because I have never once in 63 years found that crying solves a single practical problem, and I picked up the phone to call the only 2 people I trusted to help me fight my way back. Nate was 7 time zones and 140 miles of unmarked river valley away from a working cell tower, at a research camp so remote that the only communication line was a shared satellite phone the whole crew used for genuine emergencies. I did not have that number memorized. I found it, eventually, on the back of an old business card he'd left in a kitchen drawer 3 visits ago, curling at the corners, and I dialed it with hands that were not entirely steady. A young woman answered, wind audible behind her voice, and told me Nate was out on the river until evening, but she'd relay a message. I gave her the shortest, truest sentence I could manage. Asterisk, tell him his mother needs him to call home. It's serious, and it's not my health. Asterisk. He called back 2 days later from a pay phone outside a gas station in a town I'd never heard of, the kind of place with 1 traffic light and a name that sounds invented. I told him everything, start to finish, the way you'd read a report card aloud. Factual, dated, unsparing of myself, where I'd been slow to see it. There was a long silence on the line when I finished. Then my son, who has never in his adult life raised his voice at me, said, very quietly, I'm coming home. Don't sign anything else. I'll be there Friday.
He was.
His research director, when Nate explained the situation, granted him emergency leave without a second question. Apparently, even biologists who study salmon for a living understand what it means when a man says his mother is being taken from herself on paper by his own sister. He flew from a regional airstrip to Anchorage to Seattle to Charlotte to Asheville, 31 hours door to door, and when he walked through my front door on Larkspur Lane, dropped his duffel bag in the hallway, and put his arms around me, I felt something in my chest unclench that had been clenched, I realized, for almost 2 years, the particular loneliness of being managed by someone who insists they're helping you. Okay, he said, stepping back, already in the brisk, organized mode I recognized from every field report he'd ever sent me. Who do we call first? The person I called first was Harriet Doyle, who has lived across the street from me on Larkspur Lane since 1986, who taught half the county's children to play piano, and who has never once in 40 years forgotten a birthday, a burial, or a betrayal. Harriet listened to the whole story on my front porch with her hands pressed flat against her knees, and when I finished, she said exactly one sentence. You need Deborah Yates, and you need her by tomorrow morning. Deborah Yates turned out to be an elder law attorney with a small office above a bakery downtown and a reputation, Harriet told me, for a particular kind of quiet ferocity in guardianship cases where families had gotten greedy. She was not warm in the performative way Denise's friend Carol and had been warm. She was warm the way a good surgeon is warm, precise, direct, entirely focused on the facts in front of her. She spread everything across her desk that first meeting, the certified deed, the hellic paperwork, my bank printouts, the temporary order, and mapped it out for me in 3 lanes, the way you draw a lesson plan on a whiteboard. Lane 1, she said, is the guardianship hearing itself. 30 days out. We need to demonstrate, plainly, that you are competent to manage your own affairs, which, frankly, having spent 20 minutes with you, is not going to be difficult. We also need to directly rebut the specific allegations. The stove. The confusion. Whoever their medical witness is. Lane 2, she went on, is the money. $85,000 doesn't disappear into thin air. We subpoena the full Hellick file, we get the notary's records, and we find out exactly how a power of attorney you signed for hospital paperwork turned into sole disbursement authority over a home equity line. Lane 3, she said, tapping her pen twice, is whatever we find when we pull on that thread. If there's fraud in how that document was notarized, and given what you've told me about a 15-minute visit from a coworker, I'd be surprised if there isn't. That's not just a civil matter anymore. That's Adult Protective Services. Possibly the district attorney's elder abuse unit. I remember looking at those 3 lanes laid out on her desk and feeling, for the first time since the graduation party, that the ground had gone solid under my feet again. Chaos had become a plan, and I have never in my life met a chaos I couldn't outplan given enough time and a legal pad. One more thing, Deborah said, walking us to the door. In cases like this, Mrs. Whitfield, the person controlling the story is very rarely finished controlling it. You have 30 days. I'd spend the next 2 of them quietly. Quietly, I could do. I'd had 2 years of practice. Quiet, for me, meant driving to the real estate office on Tunnel Road where Wendy Pruitt worked 3 days after that meeting with Deborah, before any subpoena had gone out, before Wendy had any reason yet to be careful about what she said. I didn't go to accuse her. I went the way I used to visit a parent before a hard conversation about their child, armed with facts, but leading with a question. She recognized me the moment I walked through the glass door, and something crossed her face before she could smooth it over. The particular flicker of a person who has been quietly waiting for a bill to come due. Nate stood a few feet behind me, arms crossed, saying nothing, which I have come to understand is its own kind of pressure. Wendy, I said, I need you to think back to 2 years ago. The power of attorney you notarized for me at my kitchen table. Do you remember actually watching me sign it? She looked past me toward the parking lot, the way people look when they're calculating how fast a conversation could end. Mrs. Whitfield, that was a long time ago. I notarized dozens of documents a week. I really couldn't. I'm not asking how many documents you notarize, I said, keeping my voice at the same even register I used to use with a 9-year-old who'd copied a classmate's homework and hadn't quite worked out yet that I already knew. I'm asking about one specific afternoon. Were you there? Did you watch my hand move the pen? Or did my daughter hand you a page that already had my name on it?
She didn't answer that day.
She said she'd have to check her own records. She said she'd need to speak with her supervisor. She said a great many things that were not the word yes and were not the word no. But I've spent 31 years reading a room full of children deciding, in real time, whether or not to tell the truth, and I left that office already knowing what her sworn statement would eventually say. It would take Deborah's subpoena 3 more weeks to put it on paper. I'd had it in my hands unwritten since the moment Wendy Pruitt couldn't look me in the eye. It was Harriet who handed me the piece I hadn't known I was missing. I'd gone across the street on a Thursday afternoon, ostensibly to return a casserole dish, actually because I needed 1 hour in a kitchen that didn't feel like a crime scene. We were halfway through our tea when Harriet set her cup down and said, in the careful voice of someone who's been waiting for the right moment to say something for a long time, "Grace, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not be angry at me for not saying it sooner." She led me out to her garage, past 40 years of piano recital programs and yellowing sheet music, to a cardboard box in the back corner, soft at the seams from a couple of humid Carolina summers. Written on the side, in handwriting I recognized instantly because I'd been reading it since 1985, was one word: Walter. "Denise dropped this off about 2 years ago," Harriet said, "right around the anniversary of the year he passed. Said she was clearing out some of Dad's things from the garage to help you, and asked if I'd hold on to it because you get upset seeing it in the house. I asked her a dozen times over the last 2 years if you wanted it back. She always said not yet." I sat down on an overturned bucket in Harriet's garage and opened a box that had apparently been sitting 40 feet from my own kitchen window for 2 years without my knowledge, and Nate, who'd come with me, crouched down beside me the way he used to crouch beside creek beds as a boy, patient, quiet, watching. On top lay some of Walter's old shop tools, oiled and wrapped in cloth the way he always kept them. Beneath that, a photograph of the two of us on our wedding day, him grinning like he'd gotten away with something. And beneath the photograph, an envelope in his handwriting, sealed, addressed simply, "For Gracie, if I go first." I want to tell you I opened it immediately. I didn't. I held it for a long moment, because some part of me understood that once I read it, I couldn't unknow whatever was inside, and I had already had one very large unknowing that month. Nate's hand found my shoulder. "You don't have to do it today," he said. I did, though. That's the thing about a sealed envelope with your own name on it. Once you know it exists, you can't set it back down. Walter had written it. I'd learned from the date at the top, nearly 8 years before he died. One of those quiet, unprompted moments some men have where they sit down and put on paper the things they're afraid they'll never say out loud in time. Most of it was ordinary and perfect. A joke about my terrible parallel parking, a note about how proud he was of the classroom I'd built. And then near the bottom, this. Asterisk Gracie, if I go first, don't you let anybody, and I mean anybody, including our own kids, tell you that you don't know your own mind. You've got more sense in your little finger than most folks have got, period. Trust yourself. You always have, even when you didn't know you were doing it. Asterisk. I read it 3 times. By the 3rd time I could hear his voice saying it, the way you can when you've been married to someone for 35 years. My husband had written me a letter, sight unseen, about the exact accusation my daughter would one day stand up and make in front of 40 people, and it had been sitting across the street the whole time, guarded, without either of us knowing it, by grief and a garage. Grace. Nate's voice had changed. He was still crouched by the box, but he'd lifted the cloth-wrapped tools aside, and beneath them sat a second bundle, a dozen envelopes, rubber-banded together, cream and white and one pale blue, and every single one of them was addressed in handwriting I knew even better than Walter's, because I'd taught it to him myself. They were Nate's. The cards he'd sent me, birthdays, one Mother's Day, a note the week he'd gotten his research grant renewed. Every one of them still sealed, never opened, never delivered past whatever hand had collected the mail from my box on Larkspur Lane and decided, quietly, patiently, over 2 years, that a mother and son 3,000 miles apart were better off believing the other one had simply gone silent. Nate sat very still holding his own unopened handwriting, and I watched my son's face do something I hadn't seen since he was 9 years old and found out a family friend had been lying to him about something small and stupid. That particular, specific grief of realizing the story you'd been told about someone you loved had an author, and it wasn't them. "I thought you'd stopped writing back," he said quietly. "I thought the same about you," I said. We sat in Harriet's garage a long time after that, the box open between us, not saying much of anything, because some silences do more work than any sentence could. Denise came to Larkspur Lane 2 evenings later, alone, without calling first. Nate was in the kitchen when her car pulled into the driveway, and I watched him go very still the way he used to go, still watching a heron before it struck at a fish. She didn't come in angry. That surprised me, though it shouldn't have. My daughter has never once led with anger when something softer would work better. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same table, always the same table, and she reached for my hand the way she had the night I first asked her about the helic. "Mom, please," she said. "Think about what this does to the family if it goes to a hearing. Think about the kids. Emberly's about to leave for school. This is supposed to be a happy summer for her. And Cooper, he already asks me why Grandma's mad at Mommy. I don't know how much longer I can keep bringing him around if this turns into a whole court thing." I want to be honest about what that sentence did to me because I think it's important in a story like this not to pretend the manipulation stops being effective just because you've finally seen it clearly. It landed exactly where she aimed it. For one long moment, sitting in my own kitchen with my grandson's face in my mind, I felt the old pull to simply let it go, to protect the softness of 2 children's summer over the hard, unglamorous work of the truth. Then Cooper himself, 10 years old and utterly unaware of the weight of what he was about to say, wandered in from the car where he'd been waiting with his tablet, looking for a bathroom. He hugged my waist the way he always does, and on his way past the table he said, entirely without malice, entirely without understanding, "Mommy said once the house stuff is settled it's basically going to be ours anyway, so can I have the room with the window seat?" The kitchen went very quiet. Denise's face did something quick and controlled, the practiced kind of controlled I was starting to recognize as her tell. "Coop, go wash your hands, bud," she said, too brightly, and steered him toward the hall. I didn't say anything cruel to my daughter that night.
I didn't need to.
A 10-year-old boy had just told me, more plainly than any bank statement or deed of trust ever could, exactly what this had always been about. I walked Denise to the door a few minutes later and told her, gently, the truest thing I had to offer her that summer. "I love you," I said, "and I am still going to that hearing." She left without another word, and Nate, standing in the doorway to the kitchen, said only, "Well, now we know why she wanted the room." What we found in the weeks that followed, working with Deborah's office, turned suspicion into certified fact, one document at a time. The helic file, once subpoenaed in full, showed the complete disbursement trail. The $85,000 had moved from the credit line into an account held jointly by Denise and Marcus, and from there, in a pattern that took a forensic accountant Deborah brought in less than a day to map, straight into the operating accounts of Ridgeline Getaways LLC. The county courthouse, that same dusty, patient archive that holds every family's private catastrophe in the most public building in town, produced the rest of the motive without much effort at all. A civil suit filed against Marcus 8 months earlier by a guest who'd broken an ankle on an unrepaired staircase at one of the rental cabins, seeking damages north of $200,000. A notice of default on a business loan. A second lien, smaller, also against Larkspur Lane, taken out just 4 months before the graduation party, meaning that even as Denise sat across my kitchen table telling me the anesthesia had scrambled my memory, she was actively, in real time, borrowing more against a house that had never once, in 38 years, owed $1 it couldn't pay. The notary was the piece that turned civil dispute into something with real teeth. Deborah's office sent Wendy Pruitt a formal request for her notarial journal, the log every notary is legally required to keep, documenting exactly when and how they witnessed each signature. Faced with the possibility of losing her commission, or worse, Wendy agreed to a sworn statement. What she admitted, in careful, lawyered language, was this: she had not been present when I signed the power of attorney. Denise had brought her the document already signed, told her, "Mom already did it, I just need the stamp, we're in a hurry." And Wendy, trusting a coworker and wanting to be helpful, had notarized a signature she never actually watched me make. It didn't mean the signature wasn't mine. I believe, to this day, that it was made in a hospital bed on painkillers, folded in among a stack of legitimate discharge forms I never fully read. But an improperly notarized power of attorney is a document built on sand, and Deborah told me plainly, the day Wendy's statement came in, that we now had more than enough to not only defeat the guardianship petition, but to have the entire power of attorney declared void from the start. "Your daughter didn't just tell one lie at that party," Deborah said, closing the folder. "She's been telling this same lie quietly for 2 years. The party was just the loudest version." The hearing was held on a Thursday in the Buncombe County Courthouse, in a wood-paneled room that smelled like every courthouse smells: dust and old paper and the particular hush of people who don't want to be there. I wore the navy blazer I used to wear for parent-teacher conferences because some part of me understood, walking in, that I was about to conduct the most important conference of my life. Denise arrived with her attorney and did not look at me in the hallway. Marcus wasn't with her. I noticed that and filed it away the way I used to notice which student came to school without a lunch and quietly ate half of mine. Her side went first. Her attorney read from Denise's sworn petition: the stove, the confusion, a handful of small, carefully chosen details stitched together into a narrative of decline. Then he called the physician, a Dr. Holloway, who testified in the careful, hedging language doctors use when they know they're standing on thin ice, that he had performed a wellness evaluation and noted some indicators of possible cognitive concern. Deborah's cross-examination lasted less than 10 minutes, and I have never in my life watched anyone dismantle a story so precisely, so without raising her voice. "Doctor, how long did your examination of Mrs. Whitfield last?" "Approximately 11 minutes. Did you administer a standardized cognitive assessment, the mini mental state exam, the Montreal cognitive assessment, anything of that kind?" A pause.
No.
It was more of an informal wellness check. "So your written concern about possible cognitive decline is based on 11 minutes of unstructured conversation and, as I understand from your notes here, largely on background information provided to you beforehand by the petitioner, her daughter?" "That's a fair characterization, yes." Deborah didn't gloat. She simply thanked him and sat down, and I watched the judge, a compact woman named Judge Wren with sharp eyes and very little patience for wasted time, make a small note on her legal pad that I would later learn read simply, "insufficient basis." Denise's attorney tried once more, calling Carol and Whitmore, the geriatric care manager from the graduation party, to describe what she'd observed that evening. She spoke for a while about disorientation and reluctance to engage, careful, professional-sounding language for what had actually been a grandmother sitting in shocked, humiliated silence in a folding chair. Deborah's first question undid the whole performance. "Ms. Whitmore, who retained your services, and were you paid for your observations that evening?" There was the smallest hesitation. Denise Whitfield Cole. "Yes." "And prior to that evening, had you ever met or spoken with Mrs. Whitfield?"
No.
"So the entirety of your professional opinion about a woman's cognitive state is based on a single evening at a party, at the request and expense of the very family member who stood to benefit from a finding of incompetence." Nobody objected in time. It didn't matter. Judge Wren had already written something else on her legal pad, and by the way her pen moved, quick and final, I didn't need to guess what it said. Then it was my turn. I had prepared for this the way I used to prepare for the first day of school, thoroughly, calmly, with the understanding that the first impression sets the whole tone of the year. I did not perform composure. I simply told the truth, in order, with dates, because 31 years of grading papers had left me with a mind that holds onto specifics the way other people hold onto grudges. I walked the court through the hip surgery, the power of attorney signed on painkillers 3 days after, the statements rerouted to my daughter's address, the helic I discovered by accident when a bank statement stopped arriving. I described, without embellishment, the conversation at my own kitchen table where my daughter told me my memory had been scrambled by anesthesia for a lie that had never happened at all. When Deborah asked me to describe the events of the graduation party, I did, plainly. The stove burner turned low under a pot of soup, the 20-minute nap in the recliner, the 40 faces turning toward me with pity I hadn't earned. My voice caught only once, near the end of that part, when I described sitting in the folding chair Marcus had brought me, watching my own granddaughter's graduation dissolve into a referendum on my mind. I taught children for 31 years never to make another person feel small for something they didn't do, I said. I never imagined I'd learn what that felt like from my own daughter, in front of everyone I love.
I did not cry saying it.
I had promised myself, driving in that morning, that I would not give this room a single tear it could later describe as instability. But I let the room hear exactly how much that night had cost me, because a judge weighing a woman's dignity deserves to know the weight of what was taken along with the money. Mrs. Whitfield, Deborah asked near the end, do you believe you are capable of managing your own financial and personal affairs? I balanced a public school supply budget for 3 decades without ever once running short, I said. I taught 4th grade math to children who are now raising children of their own. I know precisely what I own, what I owe, and what was taken from me, and I can tell you the dollar amount to the penny. I would ask the court to decide for itself whether that sounds like a woman who doesn't know her own mind. Deborah closed with the folder, the certified deed, the disbursement trail, Wendy Pruitt's sworn statement, the civil suit against Marcus, the second lien filed 4 months before the party. She laid each document on the clerk's desk the way you'd lay out evidence for a jury of one, because in a bench trial, that's exactly what a judge is. It was during that laying out that Denise broke. She hadn't been called to testify again. Her side had rested, but from the second row, where she'd been sitting rigid and pale through the last 20 minutes, she stood up without permission, the way people do when the floor has genuinely gone out from under them. I was going to pay it back, she said, voice cracking, loud enough to carry through the whole room. The second the cabin sold, I was going to put every dollar back. You don't understand what it's been like. Marcus's business is drowning. I have 2 kids. I couldn't just watch us lose everything. Ma'am, please be seated, Judge Wren said, not unkindly, but with the finality of someone who has said it before and will not say it a 3rd time. Denise sat, shaking, and the courtroom held that particular silence that follows a confession nobody asked for, but everybody heard. The judge did not take long to rule. The petition for guardianship was denied in full. The temporary order was dissolved, effective immediately. The court further found, based on the evidence presented, sufficient concern regarding the validity of the power of attorney and the disposition of funds to refer the matter to Adult Protective Services and the District Attorney's Elder Exploitation Unit for further review, and directed that the power of attorney be formally revoked on the record. Deborah had the revocation ready. I signed it right there at the clerk's table, my hand steadier than it had been in weeks, and I felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe as the particular, quiet weight of getting your own name back. Real endings, I've come to understand, are quieter than the ones you imagine during the fight. There was no dramatic confrontation in the courthouse parking lot. Denise left with her attorney through a side door. I did not chase her down. In the months that followed, the pieces settled the way pieces do once the truth is finally allowed to bear weight. The bank, faced with documented notary fraud and a court referral, worked with Deborah's office to void the second lien entirely and restructure the original helic into a repayment plan for which Denise and Marcus, not I, were held liable. Larkspur Lane is safe. It will always be safe now because it is, once again, entirely and only mine. Denise was not prosecuted criminally in the end. The district attorney's office, weighing a first offense, 2 young children, and a restitution plan Deborah negotiated on my behalf, agreed to a deferred arrangement, full financial restitution over 10 years, mandatory financial counseling, supervised oversight of any future accounts held on behalf of an elderly relative, and a formal notation in the county's Elder Services Registry. Wendy Pruitt lost her notary commission. Ridgeline Getaways closed its doors within the year. I understand Marcus took a job managing a hardware store 2 towns over. I did not move Denise out of my life entirely, though I understand some people listening to this might have made a different choice, and I don't judge them for it. What I did instead was draw one very clear line, and it was not about the money. Emberly and her younger brother Cooper had nothing to do with any of this, and I was not going to let them lose their mother's presence, or their grandmother's, in the wreckage of their mother's choices. I see them every other Sunday, same as always, and I have never once said a hard word about Denise in front of either of them. That's not forgiveness performed for an audience. That's simply a boundary that happens to protect 2 children who didn't ask for any of this. With Denise herself, I've kept the door cracked, not thrown open. We meet for coffee sometimes, careful, quiet meetings where we mostly talk about the kids and the weather, and not much else yet. Trust, I've learned at 63, rebuilds the way a hip does after surgery, slowly, with real work, and only if both people show up for the physical therapy of it. She has so far. I'm watching. I'm allowed to watch. Nate stayed the whole summer, longer than his research leave technically allowed, and when he finally flew back to Alaska, we had a plan in place. A shared account only I control, a standing video call every other Sunday that doesn't depend on anyone relaying a message through a middleman, and a promise, kept so far, that neither of us will ever again let 2 years of silence pass unquestioned. Walter's letter sits framed on my mantle now, next to the wedding photograph that came out of the same box. I read it some mornings with my coffee, the way I used to read the paper. Don't you let anybody tell you that you don't know your own mind. He wrote that 8 years before he died, with no way of knowing exactly how much I'd need to hear it, and I think about that often, how the people who really see us leave us things to hold on to long after they're gone, if we're lucky enough to find them in time. Emberly left for college that fall, a few states over, and I worried, honestly, that everything she'd overheard about her mother and me would follow her there and settle into something bitter. It didn't, or at least not in the way I feared. She wrote me an actual letter that October, real paper, real stamp, the first handwritten letter I'd received from anyone under 30 in as long as I could remember, and in it she told me she'd finally understood, sitting in a dorm room 3 states away, exactly what she'd watched happen at her own graduation party. I keep thinking about how everyone just believed it, she wrote. Asterisk, including me, for about a day. I'm sorry it took me that long. I don't ever want to be the kind of person who believes the loudest version of a story instead of asking the quiet person what actually happened. Asterisk, I read that letter more times than I probably should admit, and I wrote her back the same week because I have learned, this year more than any other, exactly how much damage a letter that never arrives can do, and exactly how much good one that does. Last month, at that same coffee shop, Denise asked me, for the first time in longer than I can remember, about my 31 years teaching, not a small talk, but really asked the way you ask when you actually want the answer. I told her about the year I ran the school's first grant-funded reading program, about the boy who couldn't read in 3rd grade and was reading 2 grades ahead by the time he left my class in 4th. She listened the whole way through, hands wrapped around her mug, and when I finished, she was quiet a moment and then she said, I don't think I ever really asked you about your life before. I'm sorry. I didn't tell her it was fine. It wasn't, not entirely, not yet. But I told her I was glad she'd asked, and I meant it, and for the first time in 2 years, that felt like enough of a start. So here's the one thing I'd want you to carry out of this, if you carry anything at all. Being underestimated by the people who are supposed to know you best doesn't mean you are wrong about who you are. It means somebody found it useful, for a while, to write a different story about you than the one that was actually true. You are allowed to check the paperwork. You are allowed to ask the question twice. You are allowed to trust yourself even when the people closest to you are telling you not to, especially then. That's my story. A stove burner turned low, 40 guests who believed a lie before they asked me a single question, one letter that waited 8 years to be read at exactly the right moment, and a daughter who forgot that the woman she was trying to write out of her own story had spent 31 years teaching children exactly how to check their work. If this reminded you to look a little closer at the people managing an aging parent's life, even especially family, take that as your sign. Ask the direct question. Request the paperwork. Trust your own memory over someone else's version of it. And if you know someone who's being quietly written out of their own story, share this with them. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And subscribe, because dignity always finds its way back to the person who never stopped believing she deserved it.